It took almost half a century after the American Revolution for American history writing to take flight again on its own. There was no shortage of small scale and local history writing, but a great deal of it was really biography. Items such as Chief Justice John Marshall's worshipful biography of George Washington, Jeremy Belknap's two volumes of American Biography in 1794 and second volume in 1798. There's also Sereno Edwards Dwight's biography of his famous grandfather, Jonathan Edwards, which appeared in 1830. A great deal of Americans' historical curiosity tended to flow in antiquarian directions, and we can see that especially in the form of a string of newly founded historical societies in Massachusetts in 1791, in New York City in 1804, in Philadelphia, the headquarters of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, in 1824, in Michigan in 1828, Kentucky in 1836, Maryland in 1844. There were some practical reasons for the fairly modest profile of history writing as compared to antiquarianism and biography in the early Republic, and that is that most of the primary sources on the colonial era just past were in Britain, and therefore were not easily accessible to Americans. What's more, there were no endowed university positions in history in America until 1839, when Jared Sparks was appointed as the McLean Professor of Ancient and Modern History at Harvard. So anyone who did want to write history was going to have to support the costs of time and research out of their own pockets. It would take two generations of entrepreneurial pocket filling before sufficient means were there to support ambitious history writing projects, and even those would be limited to those who could tap generous family inheritances for incomes independent enough to let them write history. Which is why the first great trio of American history writers, George Bancroft, Francis Parkman, and William Hickling Prescott, were not scientific historians on the model of the Göttingen historians or Leopold von Ranke, whom we met in Lecture 16. Rather, they were Boston Brahmins who had enough family money to keep their pots boiling while they undertook history writing, and undertook it in more or less the spirit of an elegant literary essay. George Bancroft, who was born in Worcester, just west of Boston, in 1800 and graduated from Harvard at the tender age of 17, actually did put in 2 years of study at Göttingen. But Bancroft's first ambition had been not history writing, but rather the founding of a high school on the model of the German Gymnasium, and was only after he soon ended up bored to tears with the administrative demands of running the school that he abandoned school administrative work for writing a multi-volume history of the United States, a project on which he would spend most of the rest of his life. Even so, Bancroft kept his hand in a number of non-historical projects as well, the principal of which was politics. As that rare species in the 19th century, which is to say, a New England Democrat, Bancroft soon learned how one hand could wash the other, and when Democratic administrations in Washington offered him political appointments as a reward for his service, he took those appointments in places where he could do historical research, as when he served as American Minister to Great Britain from 1846 to 1849, and used that post as leverage to get access to the British Foreign Office's archives. But history writing was his real vocation, so much so that he probably destroyed his own prospects while running for governor of Massachusetts by diverting time from electioneering to do research. Bancroft was probably not wrong to stake his reputation on writing history rather than doing politics, because his political profile turns out to be pretty meager compared to the success he won as a history writer. His History of the United States from the Discovery of the American Continent, whose first volume appeared in 1834, The 10th and final volume had to wait until the 1870s, and then there were two further volumes on the history of the making of the federal Constitution. Bancroft's history became, for Americans, what Macaulay's history became for England, a soaring hymn of literary praise for the triumph of liberty. Two political theories divided the world in 1776, declaimed Bancroft as he held aloft the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence being a moment not of colonial rebellion against imperial bungling, but of world-class conflict between freedom and despotism. Bancroft wrote, "One founded the Commonwealth on the reason of state, the policy of expediency. The other," in this case he obviously means the Americans, "the other on the immutable principles of morals. The new republic, as it took its place among the powers of the world, proclaimed its faith in the truth and reality and unchangeableness of freedom, virtue, and right. The heart of Jefferson in writing the Declaration and of Congress in adopting it beat for all humanity. The assertion of right was made for the entire world of mankind and all coming generations without any exception whatever. And the astonished nations, as they read that all men are created equal, started out of their lethargy like those who have been exiles from childhood when they suddenly hear the dimly remembered accents of their mother tongue. Because America chose for her own that system of politics which recognizes the rule of eternal justice." But even as a partisan Democrat, Bancroft remained a Brahmin to the fingertips. And he never let himself be carried so far away by the spirit of revolution that the American rebellion could be mistaken for the uprising of the Parisian mob in 1789 or Marx's overthrow of the bourgeoisie. Like Macaulay's Puritans, the spirit of liberty never made for political drunkenness in Bancroft's hands. America was not guided by any speculative theory or laborious application of metaphysical distinctions, Bancroft loftily declared. Its people, accustomed to the cry of liberty and property, harbored no dream of a community of goods, and their love of equality never degenerated into envy of the rich. One wants to say, what, never? And perhaps hopes to hear "no, never" as the echo coming from George Bancroft. Anyone who doubted the purity of America's political principles had only to cast an eye aside to the work of Bancroft's fellow Brahmin, William Hickling Prescott, to see how the American landscape almost automatically ennobled those who walked on it. If for Bancroft it was American ideas, well, for Prescott it was the very physical fact of America itself that made for liberty. Prescott was another Harvardian, class of 1814, and he was the grandson of the William Prescott who had commanded the New England militia at Bunker Hill in 1775. Prescott had originally planned to go into law until a freak injury to his left eye canceled out that prospect. And after making the rounds of doctors in Europe, Prescott turned instead to the quieter, less demanding study of literature. First French and English, and then Spanish. The Spaniards hooked him, and in 1843 he made his American and Spanish interests meet in a History of the Conquest of Mexico, which was followed by a sequel in 1846 on the History of the Conquest of Peru. As with Bancroft, the line between science and literature in Prescott is not always easy to discern. Like Bancroft in Britain, Prescott had done his time in the Spanish archives, and he was able to draw heavily on Bernal Diaz del Castillo's history of the Spanish invasion of Mexico, which we met in the previous lecture. There's no doubt in Prescott's mind that Diaz's compatriots are a rough bunch. But under this coarse covering, however, wrote Prescott, they bore hearts stout and courageous as ever beat in human bosoms. Even Diaz's commander, Hernando Cortez, who ranks not even as highly on the scale of moral self-awareness as Burckhardt's condottieri, is still for Prescott, a man capable of great bravery. This is how Prescott describes him. At one point, trying to buy time for his conquistadores to repair a bridge, Cortés plunged boldly into the midst of the barbarians, striking down an enemy at every vault of his charger, cheering on his own men, and spreading terror through the ranks of his opponents. This might as well have been Livy or Macaulay, with Cortés in the role of Horatius Cocles at the bridge. And in fact, that is exactly the image that rises in Prescott's mind. Never did Cortés display greater hardihood or more freely expose his person, emulating, says an old chronicler, the feats of the Roman Horatius Cocles. But with a certain even-handedness, not even the Aztec in Prescott's writing are totally barbaric. When 4 Spaniards are captured alive, the unfortunate men were soon after sacrificed, and when their arms and legs were cut off by the command of the ferocious young chief of the Aztecs and sent round to the different cities with the assurance that this should be the fate of the enemies of Mexico, Diaz was appalled at the event. It created, said Diaz, a greater sensation among the troops than if 10 times that number had fallen on the field. But Prescott disagrees with Bernal Diaz. The Aztecs, said Prescott, did not, like our North American Indians, torture their enemies from mere cruelty, but in conformity to the proscribed regulations of their ritual. The captive was a religious victim. As if that made much difference to the captive. In both Bancroft and Prescott, the pre-revolutionary obsession with declension and apocalyptic has disappeared entirely. As indeed it might, since both Bancroft and Prescott had also drifted out of the orbit of the Calvinist theology of their Puritan New England forebears and moved into the arms of a genteel and enlightened Unitarianism, where declension and the millennium had ceased to excite much attention. What Bancroft and Prescott present us with instead is celebration, on the order of Herodotus and Xenophon. And in Prescott's America, even human sacrifice is allowed its measure of celebration. Of course, celebration doesn't always need to be sunny and glowing. There are darker brands of celebration, especially among the Romantics, whom we encountered in Lecture 18. And no one gave celebration a darker hue than Francis Parkman. Like Prescott's grandfather, Francis Parkman's great-uncle had turned out for Lexington and Concord. Parkman's father was a Boston Unitarian minister and an overseer at Harvard. His mother was a distant relative of the Mathers, and Francis Parkman himself was born in a house on Beacon Hill. If there had been coats of arms for the intellectual classes of New England, Parkman's would have ranked only below the Lowells, the Winthrops, and the Stoughtons. Parkman dutifully was sent to a grade school run by a Harvard graduate and then to Harvard itself. But the young Parkman showed a disappointing preference for life in the out-of-doors. The school of the woods, as one biographer put it, even though chronic illnesses kept him indoors more often than letting him play out-of-doors. Even after entering Harvard in 1841, Parkman's mind remained in the forest. And during his sophomore year, he experienced an intellectual epiphany, not unlike Edward Gibbon's, among the ruins of classical Rome. Parkman wrote, "Before the end of the sophomore year, my various schemes had crystallized into a plan of writing the story of what was thus known as the Old French War. That is, the war that ended in the conquest of Canada. For here, it seemed to me, the forest drama was more stirring and the forest stage more thronged with appropriate actors than in any other passage of our history." Parkman, however, did not turn at once to his great project. In 1846, he struck westwards in the company of a Harvard classmate, Quincy Shaw. And there, in the West, he participated in the ultimate forest adventure, an expedition westward to the land of the Sioux and the Snakes along the Oregon Trail. Parkman's memoir of his adventures there, The California and Oregon Trail in 1849, was a smash success. And it gave him the preparation he needed to begin his great forest drama of struggle between France and England for supremacy in North America. Curiously, Parkman began this great adventure in reverse, starting with The Conspiracy of Pontiac in 1851, written about the ill-fated Indian uprising of the 1760s and its chief, Pontiac. Over the next 40 years, Parkman's books zigzagged backwards from Pioneers of France in the New World in 1865 to Montcalm and Wolfe in 1884. And finally, A Half-Century of Conflict, 1700 to 1750, which came out in 1892. No single character dominates Parkman's histories as it does Prescott's. If anything, the single great character in Parkman is the forest, which is fully as brooding and romantic and ultimately doomed by the colonists who will annihilate it as the German forests of Johann von Herder. But the forest is a place of unbounded freedom, and the individuals who people Parkman's forest are, like the forest itself, unpredictable, erratic, freedom-loving, almost preferring self-destruction to the loss of that wild freedom. The redoubtable Governor-General of Canada, the Comte de Frontenac, lays aside his dignity as a white European and met the savage halfway, and himself, plumed and painted like an Indian chief, danced the war dance and yelled the war song at the campfires of his delighted allies. The Indian is an even greater icon of natural freedom, because a wild love of liberty and utter intolerance of control lie at the basis of his character and fire his whole existence. Well, eventually, the freedom of the forests must end. The French must lose Canada, and they must lose all of their American empire. Pontiac's revolt must fail, and Pontiac himself, struck down from behind by one of his own people, must be buried, as Parkman describes it, with neither mound nor tablet to mark the place. And for a mausoleum, a city has risen above the forest hero, and the race whom he hated with such burning rancor trample with unceasing footsteps over his forgotten grave. But this apparently bleak and freedomless ending has an ironic twist to it. For as the Indian loses his freedom and becomes dependent on the whites, the colonists gain freedom and independence of spirit from life in the forest. Parkman writes, when the European and the savage are brought into contact, both are gainers and both are losers. The former loses the refinements of civilization, but he gains, in the rough schooling of the wilderness, a rugged independence, a self-sustaining energy, and powers of action and perception before unthought of. The savage gains new means of comfort and support, cloth, iron, and gunpowder. Yet these apparent benefits have often proved but instruments of ruin. They soon become necessities, and the unhappy hunter, forgetting the weapons of his fathers, must thenceforth depend on the white man for ease, happiness, and life itself. Bancroft and Parkman died within slightly less than 3 years of each other, the latter in 1893, the former in 1891. Both had written in celebration of American freedom, but Parkman's was the darker vision. And almost as if to confirm that the freedom conferred by the vast expanse of the American landscape was indeed going to come to an end, in 1890, an up-and-coming historian named Frederick Jackson Turner, born not in New England but in Wisconsin, and freshly minted as a PhD from the first graduate program in history in America at the newly founded Johns Hopkins University. In July of 1893, Turner read a scholarly paper, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, at the annual meeting of the American Historical Association, an organization which itself was only 9 years old. In that paper, Turner agreed that the closure Parkman had envisioned from the death of Pontiac had now finally come to pass. Turner fastened onto a remark in the annual report of the Superintendent of the Federal Census for 1890. And the remark was, up to and including 1880, the country had a frontier of settlement, but at present the unsettled area has been so broken into by isolated bodies of settlement that there can hardly be said to be a frontier line. Turner seized on that statement as proof that the American frontier had finally ceased to exist, not only physically, but spiritually as well. As Parkman had feared, American history begins with primitive settlements along the Atlantic coastline, and over time, those settlements experience what Turner called the familiar phenomenon of the evolution of primitive industrial society without division of labor up to manufacturing civilization. But each time Americans reach westward, said Turner, from those developed beachheads to the frontier, they start all over again. They discover the frontier, not only as a demographic line to be charted by the census, but as a place where you return to the self-reliant independence of the forests. Americans could thus be kept in continuous touch with the simplicity of primitive society as they leapfrogged forward to the frontier. Only now, with the closing of the frontier, there would be no more rebirth. There would be no more primitive simplicity. Freedom would evaporate. Turner's essay mourned the passing of the frontier, but it also marked the end of the rule of the Brahmin historians in America, because Turner, in announcing the death of the frontier, was actually pronouncing the end of New England's dominance of history writing in the United States, and the passage of history writing into hands which were professional and academic, and drawn, curiously enough, from the Midwestern heartland, which had only recently actually been the frontier. The last of the Brahmins, Henry Adams, was himself a transitional figure in American history writing. As the grandson of one president and the great-grandson of another, Adams could boast the bluest of New England blue blood. But unlike Bancroft and Prescott, Adams would not have touched political office in any form had it been offered. More like Turner, Adams found a career in teaching at Harvard, and the only boasting Adams did was in the 9 volumes he wrote on the history of the United States of America during the administrations of Jefferson and Madison, published between 1889 and 1891. After which time it was clear that from Adams's point of view, the glory in American politics had departed. Adams had seen the United States sail confidently into the Civil War in 1861 as though it was a test match for the holiness of liberty, only to see the Union victory that his father, Charles Francis Adams, who served as American minister to Great Britain, and his brother had fought for, fumbled away in Reconstruction and crowned by the imbecile presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. Adams wrote that Grant's personal notions of civil government were crude, and his ideas of political economy those of a feudal monarch 1,000 years ago. And the Civil War? As far as Adams was concerned, the Civil War turned out to be little more than the steady process which indicated a certain abandonment of the original theory of the American system and a no less certain substitution of a method of government that promised to be both corrupt and inefficient. All these to be fixed upon the country beyond recall. The fabulous cupidity of the Gilded Age had smothered the nobility of the founders, and Henry Adams was left bleakly to conclude at the end of his history that history is simply social development along the lines of weakest resistance, and in most cases the line of weakest resistance is found as unconsciously by society as by water. This brooding sense that something mighty had been attempted in the Civil War only to be lost by the peace which followed it haunted more than just American historians. New England still clung to the memory of a great war for emancipation, but Southerners interpreted the Civil War as the lost cause and wrote histories of the Civil War as though it had been a brutal rape of a romantic and chivalrous society by the vulgar, cigar-chomping lowlifes of Northern industry. And the rising generation of American historians in the 1890s were Midwesterners like Turner, who had seen for themselves that the great promise of the Civil War, the promise of free homesteads and independent living, was a cruel hoax. Western farmers, discovering too late that the Great Plains were an agricultural purgatory, vented their anger in the form of populism, and their leaders turned to socialism and progressivism in an attempt to corral, or at least streamline, the rampaging greed of the new corporations. The pervasive sense that dark and self-interested forces had poisoned the promise of American life, which was the title of the progressive journalist Herbert Croly's great Progressive Manifesto. That sense that something had poisoned that promise wrapped itself around the history writing of Turner and of the other two great American historians at the beginning of the 20th century, Charles A. Beard and Vernon Lewis Parrington. Like Turner, both Beard and Parrington were Midwesterners. Beard was born in Indiana in 1874, and Parrington in Illinois in 1871, and was raised in Kansas. Charles Beard's An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution in 1913 thrust the blame for the betrayal of freedom, of the promise of American life, back not just upon the failures of the Civil War, but back upon the founders of the Republic themselves. And Beard boldly argued that the Constitution, far from being a beacon of liberty, was in fact a cunning and undemocratic artifice designed by the propertied and entrenched members of the Constitutional Convention to deflate the genuinely egalitarian potential of the Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. Vernon Parrington's main currents in American thought, which first appeared in 1927, pushed the corruption in American thinking and American life back even further to the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay. When Richard Hofstadter, Beard's greatest admirer in 20th century American history writing, published his collection of biographical explorations in The American Political Tradition and the Men Who Made It in 1948, all the great icons of American liberty, Jefferson, Calhoun, Lincoln, Wilson, are weighed in the progressive balances and found wanting. The only figure, in fact, for whom Hofstadter has a good word is the abolitionist, Wendell Phillips. From declension, American history writing had moved to celebration. From apocalypse, it had moved to talking about freedom and liberty. But now, it had moved from celebration, and it had moved from liberty. And now, it was talking about suspicion. And it would be the hermeneutic of suspicion, which would soon come to be the governing mode of history writing in Europe as well as America.